Our next presentation is from Mr. Furquan Kidwai, who is doing some wonderful work in the space of healthcare and building pharmacy for emerging markets such as Pakistan. Dawaai is such platform, which is an innovative pharmacy-led healthcare group that is reinventing the concept of retail pharmacy by taking authentic medicines to patients' doorsteps. It started in Pakistan and has grown to be the number one digital health platform in the country. So its offerings include, e-pharmacy platform with very reputable hospital partners, and also they have an in-house team of qualified healthcare professionals to, provide as and when needed advice. So, so that is a brief introduction of of their company. Now I will be handing over the stage to Mr. Furkan, who can share his screen and start his presentation. Mr. Furkan, can you hear
Th-
me?
Yes, I can hear you, Tala. Thank you very much. I'm just
Yeah.
figuring out how that's fine. Got it. Cool. Thank you, Tala, for the introduction. Hi, hello, everybody. As Tala mentioned, I'm Furqan Kidwai, and I run this company called Dawaai. We're essentially an online pharmacy, basically delivering medicines across Pakistan at doorstep. Before I got into Dawaai, about 6 years ago, I used to be based in London, was an investment banker, and the urge was to come back to Pakistan and do something here. So it took me about almost a year to figure out what I'll be doing when I quit my job and move back. And I wanted to be in the consumer space because I was primarily an investment banker. Grass is always greener on the other side. So I thought consumer space would be an easier space to do. And 220 million people in the country, quite a lot of opportunities around. So that's how I started up thinking about what to do. It is not, as we all know, that it isn't a very sort of spending wise a high spender country. So I wanted to focus on things which are essential. So I kind of identified food, clothing, and frankly, both areas weren't that much of interest. And then medicine came as a third thing. Why buying medicine is such a chore? So my mother was diagnosed with diabetes around the same time, sending a driver out who'd return 2 hours later with, I think, one third of the medicine still not being found was a bit of a mystery for me personally, who would take buying medicines for granted from places like Boots or CVS or whatnot. So that's when I started looking into it. Around the same time, the incident of Punjab Institute of Cardiology happened, when about, I think, 30, 40 people. Anyways, fine. Can you hear me? So yes, it's a large enough market which is superly fragmented, and that kind of piqued my interest into this thing. For honest, frankly speaking, plus mired with counterfeit, about half the market, 30 to 50%. Obviously, these numbers are anecdotal at best, and from varying sources, is counterfeit. So, essentially, when I started the idea was very simple. Can I make sure that people have access to authentic medicines in an affordable way and very conveniently? That's how we started the Why, frankly speaking. It was a rough ride, to if I'm being honest about it. It hasn't been the easiest journey. We started about 2014. The idea was we'll do deliveries at home. It's a low margin, high volume business. So we thought if we can set up one sort of high quality pharmacy, quote unquote, which and delivery would be taken care of by us, because the labor is relatively cheaper, so delivery cost is cheaper to do so. That was essentially the idea. We thought we'd end up taking orders over the phone, over the internet, and that's how we do. Now, mind you, this is 2014 when the broadband penetration in the country was about 3, 4 million people, vis-a-vis 75 million people right now. And we were very early to market. So there were a lot of sort of uphill tasks, which any model which I kind of made, my banker self made, could not actually predict that. But nevertheless, we tried different models. We tried general e-commerce. We tried a bit of a very specialized e-commerce. We tried marketplace. We tried a full stack model. But anyway, we by the end of 2017, we kind of figured the way out, that what sells and how it doesn't sell. And essentially, that was writing genuine content out there for people who were searching for stuff on Google. Quite honestly speaking, there was, and around the same time, search engines became quite federated. By that, I mean, they made a release where we basically started looking for local content before they actually showed the search results. So the preference was for local content, and there was no content around healthcare, the use of medicines, how to use, when not to use. and the price comparison between brands and generics. So that essentially is what kind of changed the trajectory for the business. Now, what essentially is online pharmacy, right? It has been around since the late 90s, got quite a bit of bad press in the US because of illegal sale of drugs through online pharmacies. And then it kind of, the sector disappeared and reappearing about 5-7 years ago, and now actually becoming this one of the more sexier of the plays globally. Now, essentially, it's a supply chain problem, right? For a specific country like Pakistan, it's superly fragmented. So Pakistan is one of the very few countries which is a branded generic market. So there's one sort, for example, paracetamol, which is a sort which was invented by one of the big pharma companies. The patent expired, and then it got sold as different names. So it's sold as Panadol, sold as paracetamol, or Calpol, it's sold as Paramol. There are probably like hundreds of paracetamols being sold in Pakistan. Now, I'll give you a statistic out, which will actually put things in perspective. So there are about 500 odd sorts which are registered in Pakistan by the government of Pakistan to be officially sold. Now, they are sold under 20,000 plus different names. So that's a generic market. So 500 unique medicines being sold as 20,000 plus generics. Now, couple that up with, there are about 600 plus pharma manufacturers who are manufacturing these 20,000 plus generics being distributed by 1,096 distributors. So there's almost 1:1.6 relationship between a pharma manufacturer and a distributor, and being sold into 40,000 plus pharmacies. So imagine, and now compared it to the US, where there are about like 2,000 or 3,000 generics brands, which are the sort, and then they're generic, which are sold under one name, that's it, being sold via 3 large distributors to about 2 to 3 large pharma chains. Now, this what happens as the result of the fragmentation in our space, you go to any pharmacy, they would on average have about 200 to 500 brands at best, right? So doctors writing any one of this out of this 20,000 brands, obviously there's a Pareto which works 80-20, but you're more likely than not to get everything in one place, right? So you'll actually, as a result, a consumer has a relatively bad or poor experience going out actually buying medicine. And then on top of this, there's a price regulation. So the margins are fixed, the price is capped. What that is leading to, very thin margin for the midstream and downstream players. Then that leads to another issue where there's every incentive for these players to actually interject counterfeiting into the supply chain. Now, that is essentially the problems which we are solving for. And we kind of identified that this fragmented supply chain has enough meat out there to actually aggregate it, right? To solve for the supply chain problems. Can we offer the largest range to our people? And if we're able to do so, there's enough margin out there, not a lot though, but enough margin out there which is being leaked through multiple players. So distributor to wholesaler to a distributor, sub-distributor, wholesaler, retailer. So there are about 4 middlemen in between the pharma company and the consumer. If we can aggregate and squeeze margins out of it, there is enough out there to actually take the economics, make the economies at scale, and as a result, make sure that the authentic medicines are available to patients in an affordable way. That in a nutshell is what the business has kind of evolved towards. So effectively, it's a supply chain business. We operate out of 5 warehouses. So combined warehousing space about like 15,000 square foot, which we are increasing to about 60,000 in the next couple of months. We carry a very large range of brands, which we are able to service to people. And we have been growing about 20-25% month on month over the last 2 years, essentially. We have grown 9x in 2019 and about 3.5x in 2020. 2020 now, COVID, and from adoption perspective, has been fantastic for the company. But I keep on saying when people ask me that COVID's impact on e-businesses, unless you're running a pure marketplace, which is more of a service-driven thing, that's a different play altogether. But a player like us who owns a supply chain, we are very much dependent on the offline economy as well. If our pickers, packers are not there, we have an issue. If goods are not being shipped out of factory, we have an issue. If there's an import shortage and there's a global lockdown and medicine is not coming into Pakistan, we actually have a shortage. And while there's significant adoption out there, we may not be able to serve it. So those issues have actually been quite a bit of a hangover for the business in the past few years. But nevertheless, adoption has been fantastic. And we have kind of evolved from just being a pharma, which is about 90-95% of our business, to a wider healthcare platform where we do lab aggregation and teleconsultations. But since it's a minor portion of the business, we don't really talk much about it. But we believe one of the largest provider of teleconsultations in the country by doing close to 2,000 consults a day, which effectively makes us one of the largest hospitals in the country. We don't charge for it because of lack of seamless payment mechanism. So we don't really talk much about it. But essentially, the aim is very simple. Can we solve for the supply chain fragmentation in the pharma market? And as a result, ensure people have access to quality medicines, not quality, authentic medicines in an affordable way. That is in a nutshell what the business is. I think I'll probably let questions to come through. Otherwise, I can talk all day about the business and issues. It'll be far more interesting if we take questions.
Thank you, Furqan. That was really fascinating. So my first question is: so what exactly are your numbers? What has been the growth like, firstly, and what are the key challenges that you guys face in creating impact in a country such as Pakistan?
Yes, I think so as I said, we have grown like all 9x in 2019, another 3.5, 4x this year. I would just put things like that we are one of the top 3 or 4 pharma buyers in the country right now. It's a superly fragmented space. So we're one of the larger downstream pharma buyers in the country. In terms of impact, like you see, the pharma market is about 500 billion rupee market in the country, right? If we give or take 5-6%, then there's about 30 to 50% anywhere around that. There's a counterfeiting in the system, right? On top of counterfeiting, I give this one example. The temperature out there in place like Karachi in summer is about 35-40 degrees. On the back of every medicine, it says do not store at above 25-26 degrees, right?
Yeah.
Now, how many pharmacies have air conditioning and refrigeration out there? Now, a medicine kept in sweltering heat with humidity combined for about 10 days, you can just imagine the efficacy out there. So if we are able to provide access to quality medicines in an affordable way, and by quality, which is affecting the same state as they've been produced, I think there's a large impact to be made. Now, the second bit is our customer base is not really the high end of the market. We're actually serving predominantly lower middle class and middle class, right? Is essentially what our market is, who want from us. Then the third element is it's a significant portion of our customer base, but like half of them are chronic patients. We do full refill reminders. Now, a hypertensive patient missing out his drug dose because of lack of availability potentially, or just forgetting about it, has a very high cost to the health system because it leads to stroke, and stroke is a lifelong debilitating disease, if not death. Now, if we're able, now obviously quantifying that is very difficult, but if we're able to make sure that people are taking the hypertension medicines on time and without running out of them, I think there's a significant impact. And thirdly, I think by aggregating the space, if we're able to pass on the savings to people, I think there's a big contribution to the health system where pretty much 99% of the market is out of pocket. There's no insurance.
Wow, I think you're doing fascinating work, and congratulations to that kind of growth, 25% month on month and 9x over 2 years. You mentioned that producing content about medicine and healthcare helped. What are the other tools through which you get customer acquisition? And secondly, I totally see your problem. My father is a diabetic, and when he became a diabetic, I was thinking that perhaps there should be a system like this. At that time, there wasn't. This I'm talking about, when he became a diabetic 10 years ago, that I thought that would be so cool that if we can get somebody to deliver medicine for him every month, so that he doesn't miss his dose. So what's the profile of your customers? Are they mostly repeat customers with ailments such as recurring, where they have recurring demand? Would love to know more about the profile of your users and how you acquire them.
Yeah, you see, intrinsically the business is tilted towards chronic patients, like who need their monthly medicine. Either they're rheumatic, or they are diabetic, or they're hypertensive, or they're Alzheimer's. We have seen increase in neurological disease like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's in the country. So those are intrinsically tilted towards that, because anyone coming out of doctor's clinic with a stomach ailment or a bad throat is more likely to actually buy from the pharmacy outside, because in myself I would just get it and get rather than waiting for 2, 3, 4 hours to get it done. Now obviously there is a decent chunk of the market which is for kids medicines and more like supplements for kids and whatnot, where parents have become increasingly fussy about the counterfeiting issue, and they actually want to ensure that the quality products are being driven to them. Now, those people are increasingly growing, but I would still say about half, or even, in fact, 60% of our business is tilted towards chronic ailments. About remaining 40% is split between vitamin supplements, pediatric issues, and then acute, obviously, medication, which are the kind which people need instantly. That's a relatively smaller portion, that's 7% for those, and that doesn't make sense for them to actually wait and for us to deliver within a few hours or days.
And what about customer acquisition? What are the tools which you use for that?
Yes, so it's 82% of our customer base is organic, right? So increasingly people are Googling everything, as you would know. In fact, doctors are very annoyed that patient comes and actually gives them tips what to prescribe, what not to prescribe, right? So everyone searches for stuff, right? So our the content we wrote, it was an experiment which we did, quite honestly speaking, that paid off significantly, and that also creates barriers to entry, because copying that literally gets you banished on a search engine to the last page, right? And that was a 3-year exercise which we did. It wasn't an overnight thing. So we had a team of doctors sitting in-house. It was an investment which we decided to make, and the results are pretty fascinating to begin with. So as a result of 82 to 85% of our business today is actually driven by people searching and landing on a page organically. And then obviously there's a repeat angle to that as well, right? So our customer acquisition cost as a result is significantly low, less than $1 for us. Right? So that's effectively has worked for us, and we are kind of churning it out now.
Amazing. And what's the average transaction size and ARPU?
Yeah, so average transaction size is about $25 to $30. It's about 3,500 to 4,000 rupees, right? Depending on where the FX is, right? So that's an average transaction size. An average customer buys about 2 times a month, right? So in the first week and the last week of the month, that's the average frequency of a customer buying.
And do you measure like your KPI is total number of users your KPI, or is it the GMV? And how many users do you have?
Yeah. So the users are divided into 2 parts. One is the transaction user. A lot of people come to our platform to actually find information, and that's we are monetizing with advertising revenue right now. So total user, which you said, about north of 10 million users which have used our platform, right? Our app is in hands of about 500,000 people. The app was launched about 3-4 months ago and 5 months ago. Otherwise, we had a lackluster app thing. It was a web-driven platform, pretty much, right? So for us, frankly, obviously we look at the frequency. We don't want the AOVs to go down. We don't want the repeat user not to turn up. But our one sort of North Star, if we have to speak, is our revenues, our GMV, right? Because that effectively tells us how much of a share of the pharma market we are gaining towards. But everything else supplements that, right?
So these are amazing numbers, extremely impressive. I've blown away with those numbers. So congratulations.
But it's been like 7 years, right? So it's been a long time.
Yes, your persistence, and grit. So certainly, competition. You are competing with people who do those counterfeits, right? Like, so you are trying. How do they react to you?
Luckily, our size is very small, right? At this point in time for those, because that's kind of, you don't necessarily want to take on, right? Effectively. Now, I think from patients' perspective, I think there's pent up demand for authentic stuff to be delivered, right? Now, if that's rooted towards us, that's great, because we make sure that people who unknowingly buy counterfeit, they don't get that, they get authentic stuff, right? Now, when that fight comes, I don't know how that's going to pan out, right? But it hasn't happened yet, luckily. So that's good, right? Now, it's a very difficult fight as well, because there's a mafia involved. You can't really come and say openly that I'm selling counterfeit Panadols in the market, right? Don't do that or buy from us. But we do get offers from people to intermediate and actually sell stuff at even cheaper prices than manufacturers, and we say no, because there are certain legal aspects in this system where you need to have the right warranties from the manufacturer or the distributor coming up, the batch control and expiry. Those are all legally stipulated stuff which we need to do. So it's a fairly complicated process from a regulatory standpoint, and we stand by all those, which makes our operations very, very complicated. And anyone offering such things, obviously it could be someone as an investor has invested at a decent discount trying to sell us. We just don't get into that sort of discussions, because then regulatory wise you are on the wrong, plus you don't know, have no confidence in the supply chain.
Very interesting. And in the supply chain, as in I'm not an expert of I don't know your area much, but from what little I know, the doctors, the incumbents are very entrenched that often the doctor would recommend that, go to this pharmacy and buy this over there. So he will, they would have people on their panel and they would just force you to buy it from those guys. How do you break that?
Yes, I think the doctors are entrenched with the pharma companies, right? So pharma companies are more in line with making sure that the products move rather than which pharmacy it moves from, right? Doctors could actually tell you to buy from a particular pharmacy for a specialized drug which a doctor has kept, or if a doctor has an interest, economic interest in that pharmacy, which could be next door to him. Otherwise, and I think that's mostly also from the acute perspective, someone buying over and over again, they actually want it to the convenience of their home or nearby. A classic example is one of the larger hospitals like Shaukat Khanam, Aga Khan, in Islamabad, the Shifas of the world. Their pharmacies, outpatient pharmacies, are not the sort of economic drivers, right? The pharmacy business of a hospital is 80% revenue driver for inpatient, because that's what the doctors of the hospitals control. Patients don't necessarily go back to the hospital to buy. And I think that kind of holds true for a clinic-based doctor who's telling you to buy from there. You may buy once, but the next time you don't necessarily want to buy. So ultimately, patients go to the nearby pharmacy, anything which is more convenient to them.
The last question from me, and then I'll be handing over back to Talha, who will moderate the questions from the audience. So if audience, you have questions, please write it down on chat. In the meanwhile, Furquan, you also had a great capital raise recently. I read it in the papers. You got, I think, Kingsway as a shareholder. Can you give us some color about, how much you raised, or, what's your next plan for the raise, and what's next for Dawaai? What are your ambitions? The numbers you've told are extremely impressive.
So I think I'll be, so given we've been doing this, the capital raise is an uphill task, right? And that's more to do not with the business model, because business model has been proven over and again in every market. Now, Pakistan obviously has a supply demand mismatch between the capital and the opportunities, right? So it's a pretty much a supplier's market. Now that obviously puts us in everyone's sort of the same league as everybody else, because capital is not readily available. Where we do have an advantage is that we have been talking to the same investors for the last 5-6 years. So those conversations, that know-how has been there. And as a result, we end up getting this institutional capital, which we did about 8-9 months ago. And we actually almost closed another one right now, which I can't really talk much about. But capital, frankly, for us has always been a secondary issue, right? Idea has been, can we actually build a real business which is not driven by fictitious numbers on a month-on-month basis, and which leads to sort of initial pump in capital, but not really sort of delivering long-term value. And that is kind of paid off, luckily, and that, and I think investors see it through. And obviously, in Pakistan, our perseverance and a longevity of being in the business for long enough, which in many markets may come across as a sort of a losing streak, that you've been old, stale business, that kind of pays off and actually puts us in a separate league, right? So I think that has been our thing. Most of the capital has been from outside Pakistan. And that's what we try to convince, that can Pakistan become, can there be interesting business out there for niche, interesting capital to be deployed, which has a long-term view to actually create actual value. And we are operating level profitable, I would say, just crossed the break-even line a few months ago. So everything we do is for growth, right? So we are building the infrastructure. We are investing in that rather than investing in the growth.
Thank you. Talha, do you want to?
Yeah. So before moving on to the questions, Furquan, I just have one other question. So when we were talking about competition, what about the other online pharmacies, like the likes of Dawaai? They also have, physical presence with their outlets as well. They have quite a few, outlets in Karachi only. So do you guys also plan to open up your own pharmacies? How do you guys compete with them?
I think there are two things. So one, competition is great, right? For the space. When we started Lady, there was literally no competition. The last year and a half, we are seeing this competition coming up, which in a way for us is a strong validation for the space we are in, right? Frankly speaking. Plus, the market is large enough, and converting them digitally, if people are out there spending money, we're not the only one sort of spending money and teaching people how to do so. So that's the second thing. Now, the third aspect is, right, if you named a particular Dawago, for example, I think Dawago is an offline pharmacy first, right? So they are a chain of stores across across Karachi and then probably in Sindh as well, which they're actually doubling down on. Our case is not really about opening up stores, right? We haven't done so. We don't plan to do so. Our business is all about aggregating and basically making our ops, our logistics, our warehousing, our supply chain top of the end, right? Effectively using technology. So that's a key difference, right? A walking customer walks into them actually and get it done. And I think it's very similar to Walmart competing with Amazon, uh, 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 making a website and actually selling it out, right? Or CVS competing with PillPack by setting up a layer on top of the existing physical infrastructure. So I don't necessarily see as competition, but I think it's good for the whole ecosystem in general that the pharma is becoming more mainstream as a business than it was about a decade ago almost. And it's not an easy business. I would say it's not easy. A lot of people get into it thinking we have been in business for like 70, 80 years. And we know the pharma space very well. It seems like the most lucrative of the business. And many have come in between and they left soon after. So it's very complicated. It's a very high volume, low margin business. And your return on capital is not instant. It's a long-term play. And I think that's when people realize there have been few things which came, which went away in the middle. So let's see how this pans out. But I wish people stay and actually make this business a lot more mainstream. I can't hear you, Tala. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So I think that leads to the question which was asked by one of the participants. So the question is, how do you ensure the supply chain? Do you have any analytics which caters to the same, especially the medicines which are in more demand?
That's right. So look, so I think our we have a 5 people data science team in house, which essentially does all their job is to spend day in day out predicting demand, right? And that's essentially obviously having a significantly dense data set down to the street level helps us do that. We use quite a bit of sort of regression techniques, right, to actually do that. Now with it's like an nth dimensional data, so we end up using a lot of neural networks right now as we speak. But that's an ongoing thing which we are trying to do. We are trying to get there, but obviously it's such a large space and such an erratic field, especially with our growth rates, what we're saying. It's not always right up there, but we're able to predict about 75 to 80% quite accurately. But it's definitely not linear planning of supply chain with over 22,000 SKUs. That doesn't happen and that doesn't work. And we don't do that.
Okay. Okay, great. So you mentioned that your margins are quite low. So can you give a more color to that towards that? Have you guys achieved break even? And what will be the next 5 years be like for your company? What are your future growth plans?
Look, we plan to double down on what we're doing. We are building our infrastructure, right? It's, as I said, it's a capex intensive business. We are adding up our warehousing space 5x over the next 2-3 months with cold chain. So that is actually quite an intensive capital wise business. And that's what we're doubling down on. As I said, demand is luckily not an issue for us. It's more the supply and having the right infrastructure to be able to cater to the demand. So that is essentially it's a capacity issue. So we are building that out. And that's essentially what our growth plan for the next few years is, quite honestly speaking. In terms of break even, in terms of the margins, the pharma margins are very, very straight out there. It's very transparent. So X factory price vis-a-vis MRP, which is the printed price, which is the regulatory price, is about 25%, right? Give or take. Now 7 to 10% is a distributor in between, and then the 15% is with the retailer. Now, distributor shares a couple of points here and there with the wholesaler, so they end up dumping it around. So this about 50% of the market, 40-50% of the market actually goes by the wholesale market, because the pricing is so tight that the distributor has no incentive to build out the distribution infrastructure. They end up effectively rotating the stuff on a month-on-month, week-on-week basis in the wholesale market. Now, if we can aggregate that, that's essentially the challenge for us, right? And so effectively, 15 is the minimum margin. Anything beyond that is depending on the volume. So we sit on a decent chunk of that, and that's how we actually make our money. We don't necessarily make our money; we actually invest it back into capex, as I said. But at the operating level, we are profitable.
Thank you, Furqan. And the last question from my side: how many people do you have in the company, and what are the main areas in which they operate in?
Yeah, so we have, obviously, it's an ops driven company. So we have in total about 270 people who work for us. About 110 of them are in the ops side. And then about the remaining is 50 to 60 are in the technology space, which we're looking to double up, because there are at least 15 internal products which are working on. And then we have divide between finance, marketing, and other support functions.
Great, thank you. So I think we don't have any other questions. Furqan, this was extremely interesting. I'm fascinating by the growth. You're solving a big problem, which I think everybody, all of us have. Counterfeit medicine is a big issue, and especially getting it delivered to your home, good quality medicine. And as you mentioned, for kids, that's like so important. I think every household in Pakistan would love the product, love your product. So, and I really liked and the insight which you gave, that adding content, providing information, and educating people helped grow your business. Because I think that's the key. We see that in our business as well, that most of our time the job is not selling the product, is more educating the customer. The product sells on its own once the customer has been educated on it. So it's fascinating. Thank you for coming your time.
Thank you, Furqan.
Thank you, Lintala. Bye.